Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be taking you into the depths of the deep woods, and I have the absolute pleasure of letting you know that we are being joined once again by my good friend Papa Scare. If you enjoy his narrations, you can follow a link over to his channel at the end or down below. And I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Michelle Gifford. I hope you have an absolutely amazing day. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Here is one of my stories from when I lived off the grid in the forests of western North Carolina. A few friends and I all lived in these small shacks, basically little sheds with lofts that were packed pretty closely together. Living in that kind of rough and cramped setup tends to create a deep trust between people that you do not really get anywhere else. So naturally, we did nearly everything together. Near our little semicircle of houses, there was a railroad track that, if you followed, led south to a waterfall. That spot was where everyone went to get high. So one humid night in early July, a group of about 6 of us, Laura, Andy, Nick, and a few of Andy's friends I didn't know very well but still recognized, decided to walk there in the dark. I was the only sober one in the group, so I felt a stronger sense of responsibility for everyone and was paying close attention to our surroundings. People in the group would drift ahead, fall behind, or stop altogether. So it was normal that I could not always see everyone at once. Andy was acting especially weird that night when Laura had to stop to pee. He suddenly came out of the bushes and scared her, then ran off ahead of the rest of us. That pissed off both Laura and me because it felt like a blatant invasion of privacy and was already unsettling enough in the dark. Eventually, Laura and I caught sight of Andy again, but he was off walking by himself. Then he slipped back into the bushes without even looking at us. We figured he was probably just high, so we kept going. But even after that, we still did not feel like the whole group was together. At one point, we realized Andy was behind us again, but far enough back that we could only see his silhouette. Then we finally caught up with the rest of the group and saw that everyone was accounted for, including Andy. Laura and I immediately asked him how he managed to get ahead of us and reach the group when he had supposedly been at least 15 yards behind us mere minutes earlier. The whole group went dead silent when Laura and I realized that whoever had scared her while she was peeing, and whoever had been following us, had not been Andy at all, or anyone else from our group. We never made it to the waterfall, returned as quickly as possible, and were vigilant for this possible imposter. We never found out who it was, but it was definitely freaky when you're living off the grid, to have someone invade your space and not know who the hell they were, for them to vanish into nothingness. This happened 2 years ago in Oregon. It was in April on my birthday, and we had gone deep into the woods to hike and camp, because that was my favorite thing to do. I remember this one especially well, because my wisdom tooth was acting up at the time, so I was already dealing with a constant annoying ache. We had spent the day driving through the forest and hiking. By the time night settled in, it had been raining all day, sometimes hard, sometimes just a light mist, but as the sun went down it became obvious that a nasty spring storm was moving in. We drove up a remote forest road that had not been maintained in what felt like years. Trees had grown in the road and scraped along the vehicle, but we liked camping far off the beaten path so that we could avoid other people. Eventually, we reached a place where the road widened on top of a butte surrounded by second-growth forest with a few scattered old trees mixed in. We parked, got the car ready for sleeping and settled in. I do not sleep in a tent anymore. I flat out refuse. We sat in the car, listening to the wind pick up, and it was clear the storm was going to be nasty. The trees were swaying hard, which made the whole place feel even more unnerving since we were on high ground and the wind hit us more directly. We had the windows down because the air was moving so much and the rain was only a light drizzle. It wasn't especially cold, so leaving the windows open was comfortable enough. That was when I started hearing the noises. Every so often, I heard what sounded like two men talking somewhere out in the woods. On my side of the car, the voices came through more clearly whenever the wind settled between gusts. When the wind picked up again, the sound got more buried, but it was still there. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be at a distance. I could not make out a single word, but it sounded like they were in the middle of a constant conversation, because there were never any breaks. I asked my roommate to stop talking for a minute and listen. He heard it too, and neither of us knew what to make of it. Then things got worse, or at least my fear level shot up. We started hearing what sounded like a baby crying far off in the distance on my roommate's side of the car. For some reason that made me feel sick. It was the middle of nowhere, completely black outside, and these sounds were nothing like normal nighttime noises. They were also louder than the wind from the storm. As the noises seemed to move closer, we decided we had had enough. We drove in the direction that would get us out of there, and about 2 miles down the road, we reached an intersection with a better maintained forest road and stopped there so we could organize our things, since we had gotten comfortable and left blankets on us and food out. While we were sorting everything out, we heard talking again in the distance, then it stopped completely. We sat in silence for about 15 minutes. Then we heard something running down the road from behind the car. It came up to us faster than anything I've ever seen. It felt less like something running, and more like something floating. Then this huge, black mass came right up to the driver's side window, and that was when my roommate floored it. I could not make out any shape because it was pitch black outside. I'm talking so dark you couldn't even see your face in front of your hands, but we could discern that it was enormous and completely dark. The shape was like an upright cow charging towards the car. We could tell this by the light that was leaking out from our car. We eventually made it to the main highway and drove another half hour along the ridge before camping somewhere else. By that point, we were exhausted. Nothing happened at the second spot, but I stayed on edge the whole time. It was a birthday I'll never forget. I do still hike deep in the wilderness, but I do it with protection. And even then I still get uneasy sometimes. I've had a lot of strange jobs, but one of the most interesting was working for a tax company based in Texas. At the time I lived in Kentucky, which is my home state. But because the company contracted work remotely, I was able to make a very good living doing tasks that were usually pretty simple. I had a work partner sometimes, though not always, and our job was to travel all over the eastern and central parts of the state to county courthouse PVA offices and research delinquent property taxes. We then had to compile a list of properties with unpaid taxes and submit it to our boss, who was our main contact in Texas. That part mattered, because it was the only reason we occasionally had to deal with hostile people. The company would buy the taxes if a property interested them, and then a letter would be sent to the owner saying they had a certain amount of time to pay them back. I'm not sure what happened after that, since it was not my job. But I do know people immediately assumed, mostly because they did not understand the laws, that the company was going to take their property and throw them out onto the street. Before the company bought anything, they would send us a list of the properties they were interested in. We would then go to those locations, photograph the properties, and send the photos back to our Texas contact. That was when things got interesting. I feel like the property owners had some kind of psychic sense about us. They had no idea who we were or when we were coming, since we worked mostly on our own schedule. They did not know what kind of car we would be in or what color it would be. Yet, they would frequently burst out their front doors as soon as we pulled up to take pictures. That led to some very memorable and often frightening confrontations. Once I got used to the job, I even came up with a story to tell angry property owners when they chased us down in their cars. We're from the County Property Valuation Administration. We're just updating our property files and need the current photos. And that usually calmed things down. They would apologize for threatening our lives and sometimes running us off the road and making us pull over. I have a lot of stories from this job, but this one is the best one. We were deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky one day, trying to find a single wide trailer from our list. We found a holler that matched our directions. Bear in mind, this was long before GPS, so we had to use actual county maps and decided to take a chance. As we drove further up the holler, the houses became more and more spread out, and soon we were completely isolated. It was nothing but trees and a narrow gravel road. Then we spotted the trailer. It did not look like anything, like it had the PVA picture. And time really had taken a toll on the place. Depending on where you're from, this might not make any sense to you, but in my home state, you get used to the look and feel of a location that might be used for drug manufacturing. We knew immediately that this place was a prime candidate for a meth lab. We did not even spot the trailer until we had driven a little past it, so we did not get a great photo on the way in. As usual, we decided to keep going, turn around, and get the shot on the way back. Apparently someone saw us on the way in. This was a very rural road, and by then it was barely a road at all, since it had turned to gravel a mile or two back. I had to turn the car around by pulling up onto an embankment and doing what felt like a 200-point turn in order to avoid dropping into a ditch. While I was turning, my buddy said, "Hey, look." I looked over and saw 3 people walking out of the woods and into the road. At first, they looked like ordinary people, nothing special. But then I had the car straightened out, and I noticed they were carrying weapons. A young, nasty-looking guy was wielding a baseball bat of all things. A nasty, older-looking guy held a shovel in his hand. Both of them were shirtless. Then there was a screaming girl with them. Something clicked in my head. On the drive-in when my partner snapped the photo, I had heard a girl screaming. It was an angry scream, but I did not make out what was being said, and I did not even know where it had come from. I definitely did not think it had anything to do with us, but apparently it did. Now these people were walking towards my stopped car with real purpose. I kept thinking, is this really happening? And if so, what exactly is happening? My partner was getting pretty freaked out and thought they were going to attack us. It's hard to explain what was going through my mind because I could not quite believe what I was seeing. The only thing I could think was, hit them with the car, just like in Grand Theft Auto, otherwise you're gonna die. They were screaming, shaking their weapons and closing in fast, and I was running out of time. I revved the tiny engine of my red Pontiac Grand Prix, hoping to scare them. And then I hit the gas. I plowed towards them with all the fury I could muster from however many cylinders that car had. 4, 6, I do not remember. They jumped out of the way at the last second as I grazed past them, kicking up gravel and dirt. Once we were a safe distance, I slowed down and looked back. Luckily, they were gone. Unluckily, we were once again too far from the trailer to get a good photo. I explained that to my boss when I emailed her my day's collection of property photos, and she seemed to understand. After that, I kept a loaded .45 in my glove box and felt a lot more confident doing the job. I quit a few years later, though. It was too dangerous, even with a gun in the car.
2 weeks ago, I went camping in the Zagros Mountains as part of a last-minute post-college escape. I was preparing to start working at a local law firm, but I wanted to see a little more of the world before real life swallowed up all of my time. On impulse, I bought a ticket, and 3 days later, I was flying out of Boston International Airport. 29 hours after that, I was standing at a trailhead in the southwestern corner of the Iranian Plateau, ready to hike 14 miles until the trail merged with another route. I didn't know much about the local geography, but I had solid navigation gear with me, and the path seemed straightforward enough that I wasn't worried about getting lost. My plan was to hike the trail over 2 days, then head into one of the big cities and see some nightlife. Maybe I'd meet a girl or two to show me around before heading home by the end of the week. It felt like a foolproof plan, and I couldn't wait for my first night in the woods. Everything went perfectly that first day. I covered the first 7 miles and set up camp in a small grove of oak trees. I hadn't seen another person out there, and the trail looked less used than I expected. But I loved how much wildlife I had seen. I made a fire and heated up one of my dad's MRE dinners, and, to my surprise, the military packaged beef stew didn't taste bad at all. Before bed, I made sure everything was packed away carefully so animals wouldn't get into it, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep within minutes. Sometime later, I woke up and it took me a moment to remember where I was. I lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. After a few minutes, I didn't hear anything, so I wrote it off as a dream and drifted back into a light sleep. The next time I woke, moonlight was shining through the tent window, and I could hear soft, beautiful music. At first it sounded like a flute, the kind you hear in Celtic songs. But the longer I listened, the stranger it became. It sounded ethereal, almost out of sync, as if several instruments were playing at once, and the usual night sounds of the forest had completely stopped. I untangled myself from my sleeping bag and carefully unzipped the tent so I wouldn't make any sudden noise. I didn't think I was in immediate danger, but it felt smart to be cautious, since hearing music in the middle of nowhere around 3 a.m. was undeniably strange. Once my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I could see my campsite clearly enough. Everything was exactly where I had left it. I didn't see anyone nearby, and the music seemed to be coming from somewhere off to one side of the clearing, and it didn't sound especially close. I ducked back into the tent long enough to grab my boots and flashlight, then zipped it closed behind me and started following the music. My curiosity was stronger than my fear, and I figured that if I kept a good distance from the sound, whoever was out there wouldn't even know I was there. I moved along the edge of the clearing, keeping to the shadows and trying to place my steps carefully. The haunting music drew me deeper into the darkness, and my senses felt stretched thin as I tried to track it. After about 10 minutes, I came to a halt, my chest tightening with a sudden burst of panic. Whoever was making the music was probably harmless, but on the off chance they weren't, I realized that I was completely defenseless. Sure, I could throw a punch, but that wouldn't help much if they had a weapon or could take a hit better than I could. I scanned the ground and found a sturdy branch, thick enough to do some damage if I needed it. I tucked it under my arm and kept moving. A few minutes later, I found the source of the music. As I got closer, I switched off my flashlight and waited to see who was there. It took my brain a moment to understand what I was seeing. I had expected a person sitting at a campsite playing an instrument, but all I saw was a deer. The clearing was flooded with moonlight, bright enough that I wished I had my camera with me. Then the animal lifted its head from a berry bush, and I realized it wasn't a deer at all. Its single antler was long and spiraled, almost like a gazelle's, but each prong had a small hole in it. The antler was acting like a pan flute, producing music whenever the wind passed through it. I watched in fascination, and that was when I realized we weren't alone. Along the edges of the clearing, several animals had begun to appear, cautiously peering out and surveying their surroundings. They were all drawn toward the strange creature, and they seemed to be as intrigued by its music as I was. Every time the wind blew, the animals crept closer. Soon I could see a bizarre mix of them. A couple of striped hyenas, a snake, some Persian fallow deer, a few rabbits, and even a cow. I hadn't even realized Iran had whatever that deer-like thing was, much less hyenas, so that alone was surprising. As I tried to make sense of the rest, a violent gust of wind swept through the clearing, and the once quiet animals turned, sharply agitated. Over the enraged sounds of hissing, growling, bellows, and thundering hooves, I could hear the music rise and swell, but now it had a heavier, more aggressive edge. The animals began turning on one another, and almost instantly it became a slaughter. Biting, clawing, kicking, and stomping ripped through the clearing until only two animals were left standing, the cow and one hyena. They faced each other, panting and bloody, both covered in open wounds. The cow looked like it was missing an eye. As the violent music faded, the cow shook its head as if trying to clear water from its ear, and the hyena let out a confused, frightened whimper. Through all of it, the horned creature had remained in the same spot. I don't think it had moved a muscle. Finally, it stepped away from the berry bush and carefully picked its way through the carcasses and gore until it stood directly in front of the remaining animals. They held their ground, and the hyena started growling. The deer-like creature shook its head, and a piercing whistle shot from its horn. It startled both animals, and they bolted away. I had no idea what I had just witnessed. It had happened so quickly and so brutally that I could barely keep track of any single animal, and I had to force myself to breathe steadily so I wouldn't vomit. I'd never seen bloodshed like that, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. As I started backing away, the creature daintily moved into the center of the clearing and began feeding on the dead animals. I heard bones snapping wetly, and that was when my stomach gave out. I vomited, and when I finally stopped, the thing was gone. The smell of blood and viscera hung in the air, sending my stomach into another wave of nausea. I made it back to my tent, practically crawling at times, and barely slept that night. The little sleep I did get was filled with nightmares, and I cut the trip short without hesitation. Once I had the internet again, I tried to find out what the creature might have been, and it seems like it was a shadava. The easiest way to describe it is as a carnivorous unicorn, and it was thought to have gone extinct hundreds of years ago. The animals it hunts are drawn in by the sound of its horn, and by the time they realize what's happening, it's already too late. It's a fascinating creature, but I sincerely hope I never see one again.
A few months ago, a friend and I went to hike Pikes Peak near Colorado Springs. The hike is basically a marathon in itself, with about 7,000 feet of vertical gain, and the general rule is that if you're not up and down back below the tree line by noon, you risk being struck by lightning. So we decided to do the whole thing in one day by starting at 11 p.m. the night before. We arrived at the trailhead around 10:30 p.m. and found the parking lot completely empty. That seemed very strange to me for a 14er trailhead on a Friday night in late summer. I had done other nighttime hikes before, but the lot was usually at least half full, especially in late summer in Colorado. That put me a little on edge, but I brushed it off, and we started hiking. We moved at a pretty good pace, and made about 5 miles in the first few hours, so by then it was around 1 a.m., and we were walking through a narrow section of trail with a large rock outcropping to our right. As we passed it, we heard a scraping sound followed by some rustling in the bushes, then silence. That freaked me out a little, but I told myself it was probably a deer we had startled, so we kept going. For the next couple of miles, I kept hearing small noises off in the distance to our right. About an hour later, around 2 a.m., we had passed Bar Camp, which was about 7 miles from the trailhead, and had still not seen another human being beside each other. Even the campsite was empty. I was walking about 2 or 3 meters ahead of my friend when I looked up and saw 2 glowing white circles floating in the darkness on the trail about 15 meters ahead of me. My heart sank, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My friend asked why I had stopped, and I told him to point his headlamp, which was brighter than mine, up the trail. When he did, he saw the 2 glowing circles belonged to a mountain lion. At that point, I just froze. That was the last thing I wanted to see out here. He knew we were there too, and he stared at us for about 15 seconds, then disappeared back into the darkness behind some trees. Without saying a word, I took out the bear mace and handed it to my friend. Then we turned around and started hiking back down the mountain at a very fast pace. I stayed focused on the trail, and my friend walked backwards for most of the way to make sure the mountain lion could not jump us from behind. We made it back to the trailhead around 3:30 a.m., counted our blessings, and went home. Overall, it was a very unsettling hike. Being deep in the forest without seeing any other people was already uncomfortable enough, especially when you would normally meet other hikers. Running into one of the most dangerous predators in North America made it a lot worse. I know mountain lions usually do not attack humans, but I have also been told that if you see one, it has probably been aware of your presence for quite a while, and if it makes itself known to you, it's usually a warning. So I can only assume that all the noises I heard that night were the mountain lion stalking us. We also found out the next day why we had been alone on the trail. Earlier that day, an elderly man had had a heart attack and died on the trail, so it had been closed. We had just missed the memo because we got up there so late.
This happened while I was in Boy Scouts in Utah. The first one was about 8 to 10 years ago now. We were backpacking in one of the mountains around the Salt Lake Valley, though I honestly can't remember which one. After a few hours of hiking with heavy packs, we finally reached our campsite at dusk. We lit our camp stoves, ate dinner, and then set up our tents for the night. Since it was a clear, cloudless summer evening, my friend and I decided to leave the rain fly off and stargaze before going to sleep. Our campsite was an open area, so we had an incredible view of the Milky Way and thousands of stars. It was beautiful. The tent was pretty cramped. It was a 2-person tent, but really only one person could have slept comfortably in it. We didn't care though. It was just one night. After an hour or two of talking and stargazing, and even seeing the ISS pass slowly overhead, we saw something strange. One of the stars started flashing different colors. At first, we didn't think much of it, since planets can seem to do that. But then it started zipping around randomly, from one side of the sky to the other, with no pattern at all while still flashing different colors. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but my friend was seeing it too. That freaked us out a little, but we kept watching. It kept darting across the sky at insane speeds, occasionally stopping for a few seconds before continuing again. At first, we thought maybe someone else was pulling a prank, but everyone else was asleep. We heard no laughing, and no laser pointer could have changed colors like that, so we kept watching it. We never really felt scared, just confused. Then, after what seemed like a couple of hours, it suddenly vanished. Gone, just like that. We lay there for another hour watching to see if it would come back, but it never did. The next morning we packed up, hiked back to our cars and headed home. I'm not sure if this next part is connected since he could have been dehydrated, but my friend was very quiet during the drive home. When we stopped for lunch on the way, he said he really didn't feel good, like he was on the verge of throwing up. At the time, I just thought, great, stay away from me. I don't want to get sick too. He was perfectly fine by the following Monday at the meeting, so obviously nothing too serious happened. But now, all these years later, I have to wonder whether whatever that star, planet, or maybe even UFO was, had anything to do with it, or whether he was just dehydrated. The second story is shorter. It happened during my very last campout, right before I turned 18 at City of Rocks on the Idaho side. On the way there, we stopped at the skeleton of a house to wait for the rest of the cars. It was basically just bare framing, half collapsed and littered with debris, with a big rectangular hole dug out of where the basement probably would have been. Being the stupid teenagers we were, we decided to explore a little. The leaders told us to be careful and watch out for nails and possible snakes. No one got hurt, even a couple of boys who jumped down into the basement area. We didn't find anything interesting, so we got back into the cars and drove the rest of the way. I'm not sure if this part is related, but I figured I'd include it, since it was interesting enough. The rest of the weekend went as normal, except for one kid who always got hurt and ended up needing to go to the hospital. After that, we were forbidden from climbing on the rocks. So, to protest, we broke the no electronics rule. The leaders didn't seem upset and agreed it was a fair compromise. Another friend, who I'm still very close to today, had a Slender Man game on his tablet. It was still popular at the time, and this will matter in a second. After midnight, the three of us were in the tent. Our electronics had long since died. We were just lying there looking out the window at the very small mountain we had been climbing all weekend. It was big enough that it took about 10 minutes to free climb, but small enough that you could still see the top from our window, about 20 yards away from the base. It was more like a huge rock shaped like a mountain than an actual mountain. Around that time we saw several shadowy figures, crouched low near the top of the mountain. Every time we tried to focus on one, it seemed to disappear. It freaked us out a bit. There were three of us in a tent, and all of us saw them. We decided they were probably just our minds playing tricks on us, since we were exhausted and had been taking turns trying to beat the Slender Man game. But really, We just said that to help us ignore what we were seeing and go to sleep. Maybe it was all in our heads, and maybe it was just exhaustion. Then again, I've seen some strange things in my life, and so have several of my friends. Even my father has some genuinely frightening stories from growing up in the southern Idaho desert. So I guess I'll never know for sure.
I was about 19 when I went on a hiking and camping trip with two friends in Central Oregon. It was an extremely remote place where it takes hours of driving just to reach the trailhead. We had planned a 3-day backpacking trip, but were young and inexperienced and ended up getting lost on the second day. It took us 4 days to work our way out through the thick brush, though we did eventually stumble across an abandoned mining town by accident which gave us our bearings. We rationed our supplies carefully, so food and water were never in short supply, and since it was mid-August, the weather did not become much of an issue. Up to that point, there was nothing especially creepy about any of it, but what happened on the fourth night is something I do not think I will ever forget. By then, we were all getting pretty worried. We had spent the entire day trying to find our way out of the woods, and when evening came, we settled into camp exhausted and anxious. The fire was dying down, so we threw on a few more pieces of wood and crawled into our tents, hoping to get some badly needed sleep. I'm not sure who woke up first, me or one of my friends, but we all heard it soon after. The sound was faint at first, but it had a rhythm that reminded me of a telegraph or an old typewriter, a strange pattern of random clicks and taps. I poked my head out of the tent and saw both of my friends staring back at me with wide eyes, because we were all hearing it. Nobody said a word. The fire had burnt down to a few smoldering ashes, and the sky was so overcast that we couldn't see much beyond our tents. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, distant but somehow surrounding us. I kept trying to tell myself it was just a squirrel, or a woodpecker, or anything else that might explain away the sound. But it did not sound like that at all. After a while, the clicking stopped, and the three of us just sat there staring at each other, completely stunned and visibly shaken. Before anyone could say anything, another sound started up. This one was even fainter, but it was unmistakably unnatural in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest town. I swear, we heard what sounded like radio transmissions between NASA and astronauts in outer space, mixed with music like that of an orchestra. There was a high-pitched, beeping sound, static, music, silence, and then a male voice speaking in words we could not understand. Then more static, another beep, silence, more music. The beep had an echo to it, and the static would continue for minutes at a time before being interrupted by short pauses. We were transfixed by it. The air felt thick and damp, and the sound seemed to scrape against my senses. I remember my hands shaking as I looked down and realized I had never even unzipped my tent properly. The whole thing probably lasted only about 30 minutes, but in the moment felt much longer, and none of us slept for the rest of the night. The next day we wandered around exhausted and confused, growing more and more afraid as darkness came back, and we faced another night alone in the woods. Mercifully, that second night passed without incident, though I still hardly slept at all. The following day, luck finally turned in our favor, and we stumbled onto the deserted mining town, which gave us enough direction to find our way back to civilization. None of us really talked about what happened, and before anyone asks, we were not high or tripping. We hadn't packed any alcohol either, and we didn't have any radios or electronics besides our watches and flashlights. We were completely isolated. I am now 28. I have lost touch with the two friends from that trip, although I recently found out one of them was killed in action in the Iraq War. I still have dreams about that night. I hesitate to call them a nightmare because they're not always as horrifying as much as deeply eerie, and I have pushed the whole thing into the back of my mind as something I cannot explain.
Let me preface this by saying I'm one of the most skeptical people you'll ever meet. I'm not religious, and I don't believe in ghosts or aliens in the sense of them coming to Earth or abducting people. But there probably is life somewhere out in the vastness of space, sure, but that's a different thing entirely. I think I'm getting off track here. So let me tell you about what I consider to be the weirdest experience I've ever had, and I still don't have a logical explanation for it. Also, no drugs or alcohol were involved. Anyway, my friends and I used to go camping in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, most summers in middle school, high school, and for a few years after that. Being a bunch of unorganized teen boys, or basically man-children, we always took forever to get moving. We usually didn't leave southern Massachusetts until late afternoon or early evening. One year, we didn't get up there until around 10 p.m., so instead of hiking into the woods, we decided to camp in the parking lot and hike in the next morning. After we'd eaten and unwound for a bit, everyone went to bed except for me and one other guy. The two of us ended up wandering over to a small wooden footbridge over a river. It was a perfectly clear night, full of stars, with a fairly bright moon overhead. We stood there for a couple of hours, talking about movies, games, life, and whatever else came to mind. By then, it had to be well after midnight. As we were talking, both of us started getting the same creepy feeling that something was there, and that it was sinister. Looking toward the far end of the bridge, we could see this massive dead tree with no leaves, just bare branches, clawing up into the sky. We both kept saying, "Man, I swear that tree is creeping me out. But that's silly, right?" At first we tried to laugh it off, but the feeling kept getting stronger and stronger until we finally said, "Screw this, I'm a grown man. I'm not afraid of a damn tree. I'm walking over there." I got about 2/3 of the way across the bridge when it felt like something reached into my chest and grabbed my pounding heart. I went completely cold. I backed up immediately and said, "Yeah, I'm afraid of a tree. I seriously think I'm not coming back if I go over there." So we retreated and went back to our sleeping bags by the car. The next morning after breakfast, we decided to hike in by crossing that same bridge. Halfway across, my friend froze. Dude," he said. I looked ahead. Where the tree had been the night before, there was only a clearing. No tree at all. I'm not entirely sure what it was. A demon for all I knew. But that ruined the trip for me. What touched me that night? I'm not sure I ever want to find out.
I grew up in rural New England, so if my friends and I wanted to go see a movie in high school, we usually had to drive about 45 minutes to get there. Well, one night, my buddy and I decided to see a movie. Not a horror movie or anything like that, and on the way home, I decided to take the back roads so I could make better time. Back roads in Vermont are a lot of fun, but they're also scary as hell if you don't know where you're going. A lot of them are almost one-lane dirt roads cutting through endless mountains and forest, with maybe a house every 5 miles if you're lucky. We were on one of those roads with the radio playing rock and roll, and it was snowing. We were about halfway home, and this is very deep into the woods, mind you, when we came to a hill with a blind curve at the top. Because of the snow and lack of visibility, I slowed down a lot, When we rounded the corner, my headlights lit up a spot on the side of the road where the snow seemed to stop falling. It wasn't empty space. There was snow piling up in 3 places, the way it would if a person were just standing there and the snow was collecting on their head and shoulders. It stayed like that for long enough for me to register what I was seeing. And then the snow built up, just collapsed, and everything looked normal again. At that point, I had just driven past the spot. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I had imagined it, or a trick of the light, perhaps. I couldn't really make any sense of it, so I gingerly asked my friend if he'd just seen something. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Oh, thank God, I thought I was hallucinating." We both compared notes and had both seen the same thing. After that, we turned around and drove back and forth slowly on that stretch of road, trying to see it again, or figure out what could have caused it. But despite our investigation, we reached no solid conclusion, because there was nothing there. I was hiking across Newfoundland, following an old railway that had long ago been torn up and turned into a massive trail. At night, I slept whenever I happened to stop. One day, I came across a small cottage town, but almost everything there seemed to be abandoned. The trailers were falling apart, the bus conversions were burnt out, and the little cabins were all shuttered up. It was unsettling but also strangely interesting. By the time the sun started going down, I decided to set up camp in a mostly empty lot near an old truck that was slowly sliding into a ravine. I cooked myself some food and then crawled into my tent for the night. Sometime later, I woke up to footsteps outside. At first, I thought it must be an animal, but the steps sounded too much like a person walking. They got closer, then circled around my tent. I slowly reached for my knife, because if someone tried to get inside, my plan was to stab first and ask questions later. Anyone coming up to a tent in the middle of nowhere at night was probably up to no good. My heart was thrashing in my chest, but I stayed as quiet as I could. Luckily, the footsteps eventually moved away, and I listened for a while longer, but after that, could not hear anything. I eased out of the tent and saw nothing, without even turning on my flashlight. I quickly packed everything up and shoved it into my bag. Then I started walking down the trail as fast as I could, just wanting to get out of there. I kept walking until daylight, and eventually I reached a road. I flagged down a truck, and the driver was kind enough to take me into town where I got a hotel. What still creeps me out is the possibility that whoever it was may have just watched me leave from inside one of those abandoned buildings. My guess is that it was probably a squatter. I'd rather believe he was just curious, because I'm glad I did not stay long enough to find out whether or not he would have come back. This happened in Ocala National Forest, Florida. My friend and I were hunting there and stayed out past midnight looking for hogs. At some point, we realized we were much deeper in the woods than we intended and started hiking back. We were probably 3 or 4 miles in from the main road. We were walking through the dark with serious firepower, AR-15s, sidearms, a fixed blade, hunting knives, and hip sheaths, so we were really not scared of much. The moon was bright enough to navigate by, even under the trees. We had lights mounted on our rifles. I also had a large, powerful flashlight in my hand that I could switch to strobe mode or even use like a club if I needed to. The point I'm trying to get across is that we were not exactly feeling paranoid. As we kept moving, we heard something crashing through the woods to our right, like it was about to cross the trail in front of us. Most of those trails are old logging roads, so they're pretty wide and cut the forest into square sections. This particular trail crossed one of those sections and was pretty overgrown and narrow. We figured it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear, and either way, we could not shoot at night. So instead of using the rifle lights, I used my handheld light. We waited until it got closer to the trail, and then I switched the light on. All we saw was a pair of white legs crossing the trail about 50 feet ahead of us. They looked human. We were both pretty baffled. Who the hell runs through the deep woods at 1 a.m. in shorts and not even on the trail, but through thick brush? It was extremely weird. But since we were already armed, and it would have taken about 30 extra minutes to turn back and go around that section, we kept moving. We heard crashing now and then after that, but it never came close to us again. Eventually we got back to the car, and I was relieved it was still there and had not been broken into. We kept the rifles loaded, shoved our handguns between the seats and the center console, and got into the front. I started driving out with the moonroof open, and the stars were beautiful. It's easy to forget how incredible the night sky looks out in the middle of Ocala National Forest. About half a mile later, my headlights hit a man walking along the road in a checkered button-down shirt and shorts. We were miles away from any paved road, and then it was still another 5 to 10 miles on pavement before you would reach town. This was also the northern part of the forest, where there are no old cabins or anything like that from before it became a national park. The guy had no backpack, no flashlight, nothing. I could not help wondering if this was the same person we had seen crossing the trail. What was he doing out there at 1:30 or 2 in the morning with no supplies? He didn't even look at us as we drove past. Once we got close to the paved road, we unloaded the rifles, put them in the truck, and headed home. It was a really fun trip, and I cannot wait to go back, but I would definitely be armed in the Ocala National Forest, because some seriously weird things happen out there. I have been doing my 1 hour of outdoor exercise at night because I find it the most relaxing. My neighborhood is very quiet, and I'm lucky to live in a nice area that I've always considered very safe. I used to walk at night even before the COVID lockdown because I live right next to a canal, so there are plenty of lovely paths that look especially pretty after dark when everything is lit by the moonlight. So I was walking last night and decided to stop at the shop first as I was hungry. Then detour back to my usual route along the canal. While I was walking, I heard 2 men speaking very loudly in German. I live in England, so that was a little unusual, not too much though, but nothing that really made me pause for thought. They looked to be around 30, were fairly tall, and were both wearing caps. I remembered because their caps had matching designs, which I thought was kind of interesting. Then they started getting closer. When I glanced back at them, they began jeering, so I realized they were focused on me. That made me a bit uneasy, so I speed walked towards the shop. I had to stop at the road because I didn't want to be hit by a car. It was during this pause that they caught up to me, but instead of waiting for the lights, they just crossed the road and went into the store, which I had been heading for. I was hungry, but at that point I gave up on going in and decided to head straight to the canal for my walk instead. I stopped thinking about them after a while and assumed I was just being anxious. I do not enjoy walking past strangers at night. I'm already self-conscious enough without people talking to me or about me, so I finished my walk and began heading home. To explain the layout, on my right was the water. I was standing on the path, and to my left, there was a steep drop straight down to the main road. Next to that road was a row of houses, and there was a railway bridge in front of me. I had my earphones in, and my music was on pretty loud, but I thought I heard someone shouting. That's when I removed one earbud out and listened. It was quiet apart from the cars going past below me. Then I saw two men heading towards the bridge. I immediately recognized them as the same two guys from before because of their caps. I stopped walking and my anxiety came rushing back. I considered calling someone because I irrationally thought that if I was on the phone with someone when they walked past me, they might be more prone to leave me be. But even though I had been standing there frozen for what felt like an age, nobody emerged from under the bridge. I waited and stared at the bridge in total confusion. There was no way they could have vanished. I could see through to the other side, so I knew they hadn't turned around and gone back, and they certainly hadn't walked through because no one had passed me. After a few moments, I started wondering if I had somehow hallucinated them. I've never had a hallucination before, but had no other way to explain it. I started slowly walking towards the mouth of the bridge. Just as I was about to step in, I saw the shadow of one of the men stretched across the wall. My blood went cold when I realized what was happening. They were waiting for me on the other side of the bridge. They must have hidden behind the abutment so I wouldn't see them. My mind immediately went in 100 directions. I panicked, wondering what they would do if I walked under there. I was sure they would follow me, but if I stayed where I was and called for help, I was certain they would come out and see what was going on and I would be trapped. The only thing I could think to do was quietly run to the fence separating the canal path from the drop down to the main road and climb over it. It was only about thigh height, and on the other side there was a small space before the wall and the drop itself. I waited a few moments as cars passed by, but thankfully I live in a quiet area, so the road was empty again soon after. I managed to lower myself down without making much noise or hurting myself too badly. And the moment my feet hit the road, I ran to the side with the houses and sped walked down that road as quickly as I could without drawing attention to myself. I only looked back once near the end of it. The men were still by the bridge. I could see them looking through it, trying to discern where I had gone, and I felt sick to my stomach. But I made it home. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know who they were, and I don't know whether they will be there again tonight. But I do know I'm not going to be going out walking in the woods or the river anytime soon for a long time. It simply isn't worth it. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's collection of Deep Woods scary stories. If you have, you can always let me know down below. Your thoughts and comments really and truly are very much appreciated. Not only that, I would like to give a huge thank you to my good friend and collaborator, Papa Scare. If you enjoyed his narrations, as I certainly did, you can find a link down below to see more of his work, or follow the link on screen shortly. I would like to give one final thank you to my amazing members and patrons. Their names are floating now all over the credits, and if you would like your name at the end, as well as receiving a bunch of additional content and supporting me and receiving my infinite gratitude, you can follow the links to find out more. But that's it from me, guys. Stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.